I realized, like, I kind of assumed that everybody knows who Dennis Peron was. I shouldn't assume that. So just a quick crash course. He's the one, along with Brownie Mary and tons of other people who, in the mid-90s, pushed through medical cannabis. And the reason we have medical cannabis and even the medical cannabis industry is because of Dennis Peron. You know, he was the one he brought medical cannabis to San Francisco first, and then California eventually caught on, and he literally changed the world, because I don't know if we would have ever had medical cannabis. I think we might have gone right to regulation, or right to adult use legalization, but I don't know what was that? Almost said it right. I don't know if we would have had cannabis recognized as a medicine without him. So like I said, I just assumed that everybody knows what he did. So please, like, if you don't know who Dennis Peron was, go home and Google him. There's tons of articles about him. It's so important for us. We can't really go where we want to go without, like, knowing where we've come from. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Daniel, who was a dear friend of Dennis and was his caretaker for the last 7 years. So thank you for loving our hero and caring for him. We love you and we thank you.
You know, following that, it's kind of hard, you know, not to be compelled to, you know, go into all of these, you know, all the stories, all the, God, just everything I've heard from him and his family and everything. I've only had the pleasure to know him in his retirement in the last 20 years. So to see a man that was, to a lot of God, a savior to most, you know, to see him in his retirement and still helping people, you know, set up a bed and breakfast, kind of a bed and breakfast that, you know, it turned into an international bed and breakfast that kind of educated people of kind of marijuana and how in one little city in our country we're kind of getting away with it, you know. And, you know, as Dennis said, you know, it took him 30 years to get it legalized. And I think today, being the 64 passed, even though he's not a fan of it because it's really restrictive on a lot of people, and I mean, God, we get pulled over, you know, for smoking now, which we only would get in trouble if we had a bag. You know, they wouldn't say we were stoned, so that part kind of sucks.
We're working on it.
But to say one thing, you know, his mission was compelled by the death of a lover. You know, AIDS hit the city really hard, and he found that weed made it so he could cope. You know, it's just easier to deal with your pain. You know, you could chuckle about bullshit and anything. But it still came down to this one word, and he said, you know, all these years, all these bills, all these, you know, so much politics trying to get this stuff done, it took one word. It was medical. And even though his passion was kind of, you know, all kind of just fed by this love for a lost one, you know, all being medical. It's funny that it was just this one word that it was what it truly was for. And it's like he says, even though we have recreational pot, even if you're smoking it just to relax, it's medical. You're relaxing, you know?
That's right.
So, but the only reason I actually was going to say something. So, seeing him, you know, being his friend in the later years and everything, he actually said something 3 weeks ago that was really touching. The girls that are putting this calendar together for him, it was, you know, to get him more spending money in the end, maybe, you know, do some funny shit or whatever. You know, one of the girls brought him some money, and she said, I'm sorry, I wish it was more, you know, we have to sell these calendars, you know, the money's coming. And he said, you know, if I have $20, I'm rich. You know, for a man that I think the DEA had occupied a building across from the 4-story, he used to call it the 4-story felony, 1444 Market. They said something, I always remembered the story going, it was $49 million a year that they had figured. They just figured every person bought at least an eighth. Imagine. God knows, you know, people buy pounds and everything. So God knows the true money behind it, you know. But it's like, you know, I'm sure if, knowing people that have been so much in the media or have done so much around the world, like, I couldn't imagine, like, living with Mother Teresa or something, But it would almost be kind of the same, because they're not like an actor or something that have got all this money for doing just some simple talent. It's because you've made such a difference with just your heart. That's all. That's you. So in his retirement, he was still doing that. People from around the world have done it for the last 20 years that I've been around. They always stop and you can stay on his couch. Always. You can always stop into the castle. You always have a warm place to stay. A hot shower and a nice meal. Like, and it was always that way. So even in the end, for a man that had so much money, it always went out to him, back right to everyone else. So it was an honor to be his friend and to well, there goes, help him at the end. So I'm not much of a mic guy. Everyone, this is all for Dennis.
I'm going to call on Granddaddy Mike to round it all out. He's been a longtime friend of Dennis, and Dennis would always say, Granddaddy Mike always has the best weed. So make friends with this guy if you're not already.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for all coming out. It's so great to see you all. Dennis would have loved to see this kind of a community and this kind of event right now. So, insofar as you've all gotten yourself here, I want to just make sure that everybody realizes you're all Dennis Peron activists. And we would not be here, and we've all told it before, but literally, we would not be in this room right now if it was not for Dennis. Okay? And if you don't appreciate that fact, like was so before, educate yourself about this man. This man was a wonderful man. I met Dennis lived at 17th and Dolores, and I lived at 15th and Dolores, and we both walked our dogs in Dolores Park. For 10 years, when I knew Dennis as another dog walker who smoked weed, right? Neither one of us acknowledged that we were both in the cannabis business. That's how underground we were at that time. Right? So I was just another dog walker who had, Dennis thought, really good weed. And we would just sit on a park bench and get stoned and watch our dogs play. Dennis, I'm in a position where I can tell you some things that you're not going to find on Wikipedia, and you're not going to find out there in some of the other statements. So I'm going to tell you some skinny stuff. All right? You want to hear some skinny stuff about Dennis? Yeah. Dennis Peron, when he went over to Vietnam, he enlisted in the Air Force to avoid being drafted into the Army. I thought the Air Force would be safer. Ended up spending 2 years over in Vietnam. On his way over, he was in San Francisco. And he fell in love with the place. Thought it was great. Vowed that if he survived the Vietnam War, he was coming back to San Francisco. Well, he came back and he brought 2 pounds of weed with him. Right? And he came back as a proud gay man. And those 2 things changed history in San Francisco. Dennis was a very complex guy. He was all heart. He loved everybody. He would engage with everybody. And he wanted to help everybody. Dennis ended up, after a few years, settling into a restaurant, finally owned a restaurant, ran it on Castro Street. Very successful restaurant. In the back room, gay man on, Castro Street running a restaurant. In the back room, he's slinging weed, right? So, and arguably, he was the biggest dealer in the Castro district for at least a decade. So there were people in the cannabis industry and the cannabis movement that knew Dennis during that time as, a very successful, high-volume drug dealer. We were talking the other day about what we think post hoc was really happening, and we came up with 100 pounds a week. Wayne, right? About 140. And when we talked about it, we realized that's what he would admit to. Right? If you knew Dennis, you realized he had to acknowledge some of it just because so many people knew him and knew he had good weed, right? But Dennis was an outspoken activist. He was a courageous man. He was arrested 27 times. 27 times arrested for cannabis offenses. Tried 7 times. Convicted 4 times. Spent a year in prison, right? And he was a smaller of stature, hippie-looking gay guy, right? Who was a drug pusher. And so he was violently abused by the police when they arrested him. He was persecuted while he was incarcerated. He was beat up, right? He was intimidated, he was threatened. And of course, the man just wanted him to shut the fuck up and stop doing this. When he found out, when the AIDS epidemic came and his compassion kicked in, and he and Brownie Mary started providing brownies to people to help them with their suffering, Dennis never hesitated to know what was right for the people and what was right for the cannabis. It was as though he was a representative of the cannabis, and his job was just to make sure that those that needed it most got it.
Yep.
And so he gave away thousands and thousands of dollars of cannabis, right? He lost his home, he lost his job, he lost all of his money. And it happened many times. And what separates Dennis perhaps from the rest of us is that he always got back up. He always bounced back, right? He never stopped, right? You need to understand that as we continue on integrating cannabis into our culture here, this man was the root of medical marijuana, not only in San Francisco, but in the state of California, in the nation of the United States, and all over the world. Many people realize we would not have gotten this far with regulation if we hadn't had the step of medical in the interim. Now, I want to let you know there will be some controversy about what Dennis stood for, what he agreed with, etc. I want to let you know Dennis believed in tearing down the walls, right? The walls of incarceration, the walls of misunderstanding, the walls of ignorance that separate us from each other, right? Tear down the walls, free the weed, right? Free the weed and, release all the POWs, the weed POWs. There should not be anyone in jail for pot. Dennis ardently believed, was committed lifelong to those principles. The compassion program, yes, everybody who needs it needs to have access to cannabis, right? And if you're not participating in that or contributing to that, then you are not fully living up to his legacy. So it's time for all of us to recommit. It's time for all of us to, frankly, I realize that no 100 of us in this room are going to be able to carry the mantle that Dennis carried for this industry, right? So we're all going to need to recommit. Now, Dennis would also, one thing he wouldn't have liked about this event is that we can't smoke weed. I just want to throw that out there. Dennis, by now here, Dennis would have found a place outside, close by, where he would stand and smoke a joint, right? I mean, or a pipe or something. But, I just wanted to say, Dennis was for, smoking the flower. But, as we move forward, cannabis is medicine, right? We are all activists, right? We need to all provide compassionate access to everyone. Cannabis needs to be descheduled, right?
Yes.
Cannabis, we just need to take it out. These are all the kinds of things that Dennis, would have supported. In that spirit, we have a pop-up event, all right? On 2/15, in commemoration of Prop 215, right? So that's Thursday, next Thursday. Okay, next Thursday, a pop-up event in San Francisco in a public park where we're going to just have a smoke out. Okay, we're all going to get together in the spirit of Dennis, and we're going to have some civil disobedience. Right? We're going to stand united, and we're going to say, look, we believe this ought to be legal, right? And we believe that Dennis thinks this ought to be legal. So we're going to act as if it's legal, right? Do we really want to put all of us in a cage for doing this? You know? So I encourage you all to, be brave, stand up, never quit, and, remember Dennis Peron.
Thank you, Granddaddy. And thank you to you all for your kind attention during this memorial for Dennis. I want to end with a moment of silence for Dennis and for John Hudson and for Ariella and all the activists who have recently passed on, and a moment of silence for the people who have died and are currently dying needlessly because of lack of cannabis access. If you can just join me for a moment, thank you.